Welcome back. Now, in the last video, we mentioned this interesting and strange little issue where when we press play, we're possessing our bird because we've set auto possess player to true, but we also get the default pawn, and we know that that's because our project settings has a particular game mode configured to be used, and it's going to use that default game mode if our world settings doesn't have a specific game mode set. Now, in this video, we're going to take care of that issue by creating a game mode and specifying the bird as the default pawn. So let's open the content drawer and go to our blueprints folder and right-click and make a new folder called game mode. And here we're going to create our game mode. Now, for now, we're just going to create a game mode blueprint. We'll learn later how to create a C++ class for the game mode, but for now we're just going to fix this issue so we don't have a default pawn spawned in our world. So I'm going to right click and make a new blueprint class and choose game mode base. Game mode base is a basic game mode class that has the ability to specify the default pawn as well as the other default classes. So we're going to select game mode base and we're going to call this BP underscore bird game mode. And that way we know that this game mode specifies the bird as the default pawn. Now let's double click and open up the blueprint editor for this game mode blueprint. And right here in classes in the details panel, if we look down here, we see default pawn class. And it's set to default pawn by default. But if we click the drop down, we can select other pawns. And we have BP bird. We want to select that. Now notice we have bird and BP bird. Bird is the C++ class, and remember, our C++ class does not have a skeletal mesh selected for the skeletal mesh component, but our BP bird does. So it's very important that we select the blueprint version as it has more information, such as the bird skeletal mesh. So let's select BP bird, and we can compile and save our BP bird game mode and close it. So now that we have a BP bird game mode, we can specify that game mode here for our /open world. So for game mode override, we're going to click the drop down and override the game mode for this level, and we're going to choose BP bird game mode. And now we should spawn by default a bird pawn and possess that. And we now no longer need our BP bird here in the world. So what we can do is select BP bird and simply remove it from our world by hitting the delete key. And now we no longer have that BP bird. And if we press play, we'll spawn a BP bird as the default pawn instead of that gray sphere that we saw before. And if we hit Shift F1 to get our mouse cursor and search for default pawn, there is no default pawn. We're not spawning that anymore. So this way we only have a single pawn, and we actually don't even need one in the world. It gets spawned by default when the game starts. Now, you may be wondering, how do we specify where to spawn it? Well, right now, wherever our camera is in the world, that's where it'll spawn. So if I hit 2, I have a bookmark way over here across the map, and if I press play from here, then I'll spawn my pawn right here. So we really don't have control over where the pawn spawns by default. That's where the player start class comes in. If we place a player start in the world, then we'll spawn our pawn at that player start. So for example, I can hit 1 to go back to my first bookmark and put a player start here. And we can get a player start by clicking the drop down for this cube icon and going to the Place Actors panel. And here's a player start. We can click and drag one in right into our world right there. And if we press play, we'll spawn right there at that player start. So now it doesn't matter where we are in our world. I can hit 2 and go way over to this bookmark here and press play. And I'll still spawn at this location because here is where my player start exists. So that's how player starts work. They have to use the default pawn configured for our project. So now we only have a single bird spawning in. Now, I'd like to show you a side effect of the way we had it before. If I go to my game mode override and I simply set this to none, well, we know that when we press play, we'll get our default pawn, which is not really what we want, right? But let's say that we did drag in a bird. So we can go to Blueprints, Pawns, and drag in BP bird here. And we know that we'll spawn a default pawn, but then we'll possess this bird. Well, if I press play, and I'm possessing the bird, there's our annoying default pawn we don't want. But here's an interesting side effect in the open world game type. Let's say you're testing your game and you might have discovered this flying your bird around your map. If I fly far enough, I'm going to have that open world algorithm triggered where it loads the next section of my open world map and it's going to transition me over to it. But our default pawn is going to be left behind. So here's what happens. I'm flying along. I'm having a good time. I'm checking out the scenery and oh, look at this. I don't see my bird anymore and I can't move or anything. And that's because if I hit Shift F1 and come over to the outliner, I can search for bird and there is no BP bird because I'm in the next section over in my open world map. My bird is actually in the next section over. If I detach and come over here and just kind of scoot on over, there's my BP bird. It comes back. And if I scoot back to the other section, the BP bird is unloaded. Now here's the thing. If our bird is unloaded, it's like it doesn't even exist. So if we're in this section of our open world, there is no BP bird. So we're not actually possessing that pawn anymore. And that's because our game does not consider that bird to be the default pawn. It considers the default pawn, which is configured in our game mode that we're using, which is in the project settings. That default pawn, which is way over there, that determines what gets loaded and unloaded in our map. So that's an unfortunate side effect to doing it the way we did before. So what we can do instead is not use a bird when there is a default pawn already in the world. We can simply instead use our custom game mode, which we call bird game mode. And now when we press play, then we have our bird. There is no default pawn. And when we transition into the next section of our open world map, our bird will come with us and we'll continue possessing that bird. And we can fly into any section of our map, loading in the new section as we transition into it and unloading the previous section as we transition out of it. Now, some things remain loaded so we can still see them. As you can see, I see those cliffs in the distance because, well, they are in the next section over, but it's important enough for us to see those so we can see them visually. But things like pawns load and unload. And as you can see, I'm flying way beyond the limits of that section where we spawned in, and I'm still flying the bird. I still am able to control the bird, and the default pawn is the bird, so it's coming with me. And as that default pawn transitions into the next section of my map, I'm still controlling it. We don't have any issues. So that's why it's important to have our default pawn set to the pawn that we plan on possessing and controlling throughout the game. And that way we can move throughout the world just like we would expect and have no issues. So that concludes this video. We now have our own BP bird game mode blueprint, and this is great. Now, again, we're going to learn how to do that from C++ very soon, but for now, at least we have our default pawn configured, and our game will work as expected. Great job. I'll see you in the next lecture.